Out in Prairie Creek, folks still whisper about the crippled war vet and the girl in the wheelchair. Caleb Stone was the man who fixed broken clocks with one good leg and a 1,000-yard stare. Elara Vance was the daughter of the richest man in Riverbend and the most hunted secret he ever tried to bury. They said she rolled back into town like a ghost, dragging a past that could burn the whole place down. And they laughed when Caleb stood beside her, called him fool, called her worse, but they didn't know what it meant to be broken and still choose to build. This isn't some love story tied up in ribbons and prairie flowers. It's a reckoning. It's about what happens when two discarded souls decide to stop running and start fighting. Against lies, against fear, against every man who said they didn't matter. The hammer fell, the truth rang out, and Prairie Creek was never the same. What did you think of today's story? If it brought you any warmth or made you smile even for a second, drop a simple "good" in the comments below. Got your own thoughts or feelings? I'd love to hear them seriously. And hey, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It's free, and it truly helps us grow this space for stories that matter. Thanks so much for being here. The wind, a perennial tormentor in the God-forsaken stretch of flatland known as Prairie Creek, clawed at the loose boards of Caleb Stone's workshop, its mournful howl a fitting soundtrack to his existence. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of rust, old oil, and the ghosts of 1,000 broken things he'd coaxed back to life. Caleb himself was a study in fractured resilience, a leg shattered by canister shot at Shiloh, dragged with a stubborn, rhythmic thud as he moved, a constant reminder of a past he couldn't outrun. His hands, though, were deft, surprisingly gentle as they navigated the guts of a stubborn clock or the splintered stock of a farmer's rifle. Scars, both visible and hidden deep within, mapped his 40-odd years. From his grimy window, Prairie Creek offered a bleak panorama, a straggle of sun-bleached buildings huddled against an unforgiving sky, its inhabitants etched with the same harsh lines as the landscape. Survival here was a grim communion, and kindness a currency too scarce to trade freely. He'd seen it all in his 5 years here, the petty cruelties, the whispered judgments, the slow erosion of hope in faces that had once dared to dream. He mostly kept to himself, a sentinel of scrap and sorrow. Then Elara Vance rolled into his line of sight, and into the stagnant waters of his carefully guarded solitude. She navigated the rutted main street in a wheeled chair, its wood-scarred, its iron rims groaning in protest, a contraption that looked as pieced together and battle-worn as he felt. She was young, perhaps barely out of her teens, with a pale, determined face and eyes that held a fire fiercely banked against the town's collective scorn. He watched her struggle to maneuver her chair over the uneven boardwalk towards the general store, the stares of the townsfolk like invisible barbs. He heard the snickers, the muttered comments, "Silas Vance's girl," "a cripple," "bad blood," each one a small, ugly stone cast. Her specific difficulty today was a sack of flour, too heavy to balance on her lap, too precious to leave behind. Old man Hemlock at the mercantile had simply plunked it on the counter, his face impassive, offering no assistance. She was trying to wrestle it into a sling fashioned from an old shawl when Jedediah Smith and his pack of town loafers swaggered into her path. Jed, a lout with a face full of cheap whiskey and mean intent, was Prairie Creek's self-appointed tormentor of anything weaker than himself. Well, Jed drawled, his cronies sniggering behind him. He kicked one of her wheels, a casual, contemptuous gesture. Look what the cat dragged in. What's the little cripple doin' all by her lonesome? Trying to play homesteader. His eyes roved over her. Insulting, Heard your pa was a real piece of work. Guess the apple don't fall far, even if it can't walk. Alara's hands tightened on the arms of her chair. Her voice, when she spoke, was low, dangerously controlled. I'm just trying to buy supplies. Jedediah, if you'll excuse me. Excuse you? Jed laughed. Where you gonna go? Gimp roll. Off into the sunset. He leaned closer, his breath foul. Maybe you need a man to push you. A real man. Caleb had seen enough. The familiar rage, cold and quiet, that had served him well in battle, began to uncoil in his chest. He laid down his file, the rasping sound ceasing abruptly. His shadow fell over the group as he limped from the dimness of his workshop into the harsh sunlight. Jedediah, sensing a shift, turned. His bravado faltered slightly when he saw Caleb's eyes, flat, hard, like gunmetal. Leave her be. Jed. Caleb's voice was a gravelly rasp, devoid of inflection, but carrying the weight of old violence. Your fun's over. Jed puffed out his chest, though his eyes flickered. This ain't none of your concern. Stone, just having a word with the lady. I said. Caleb repeated, taking another slow, deliberate step, his bad leg dragging. It's over. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. There was something in his stillness, in the set of his jaw, that spoke louder than any threat. Jedediah held his gaze for a moment longer. Then, with a muttered curse and a last, venomous look at Alara, he gestured to his friends. Come on, boys. Stinks like old iron and pity out here anyway. They sauntered off, their laughter forced. Caleb turned to Alara. The fire in her eyes was banked now, but he saw the tremor in her hands, the rigid set of her shoulders. He gestured with his chin towards his workshop. Got coffee upstairs. Hot. And no one to bother you there. Alara looked at him, her expression wary, suspicious. The town's poison had clearly seeped deep. Why are you helping me? She asked, her voice tight. Caleb shrugged, the movement stiff. Maybe 'cause I know what it feels like to be stared at. Or maybe I just don't like bullies. He met her gaze squarely. No pity in his, only a shared understanding of being an outsider. Flowers heavy. I can carry it. She hesitated for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for some hidden motive, some trap. Then, with an almost imperceptible nod, she relented. The alternative was to remain exposed, a target. The atmosphere inside Caleb's workshop was initially as strained as a rusty hinge. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light that pierced the gloom. Tools lay in ordered chaos on scarred benches. He placed the flour sack on a crate. Then, without a word, knelt by her chair, his attention drawn to a wobbly wheel and a frayed leather strap. This needs mending, he stated, not asked. Alara watched him, her guard still up. I can manage. You can, he agreed, already selecting a tool, but it'll ride smoother if it's trued. His hands, surprisingly nimble for their scarred appearance, moved with a practiced economy. He worked silently. The only sounds the scrape of metal, the creak of leather, the rhythmic tick of a dozen clocks in various states of repair. Alara found herself observing him, the meticulous care he took with her chair, the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the deep lines of sorrow etched around his mouth when his face was in repose. He was a puzzle. This limping, taciturn man, an unexpected, unasked-for intervention. Why, she wondered again. The question a silent refrain in her mind. Her past was a gallery of betrayals. of kindnesses that always came with a price. Her father, Silas. The thought of him was a cold stone in her belly. He'd taught her the bitter lesson of distrust, a lesson reinforced by every town she'd been forced to flee. The unspoken truce within the workshop walls did little to insulate them from Prairie Creek's hostility. When Caleb limped to the mercantile for his own meager supplies later that day, the whispers followed him like flies. Stones taken in that cripple girl. No good'll come of it. Like calls to I reckon, broken things, broken people. Widow Higgins, the town's self-appointed moral guardian, a woman whose piety was as starched as her bonnets, even made a point of visiting. She stood in Caleb's doorway, her nose wrinkled at the workshop's honest grime, her eyes flicking towards the curtained-off alcove where Alara had found a small measure of privacy. "Mr. Stone," she'd said, her voice dripping with insinuation, a word of Christian concern. "That young woman. Her reputation precedes her. Her father, Silas Vance, was a godless man, a troublemaker. It's not seemly. A lone man such as yourself, harboring, well," Caleb had merely stared at her, his expression unreadable, until she'd flustered and retreated, muttering about decency and falling standards. He hadn't dignified her venom with a response. The isolation he usually cultivated now felt different, shared. A few days into this uneasy cohabitation, a tattered envelope, bearing no return address and postmarked from a town far to the south, he hadn't thought of in years, appeared under his workshop door. The handwriting was crudely familiar, stirring a cold unease in Caleb's gut. He tucked it away, unread, a ghost he wasn't ready to face. Meanwhile, at the Prairie Creek saloon, a newcomer, a man named Marcus Thorne, dapper and soft-spoken, but with eyes that seemed to miss nothing, was making quiet inquiries. He asked about job prospects, about the town's mood, and then, more pointedly, about any new arrivals, specifically a young woman, perhaps indisposed, and if anyone had seen strangers frequenting the old soldier's workshop at the edge of town. His questions, dropped like casual pebbles, nevertheless created ripples of speculation among the barflies. A shadow was lengthening, its edges still indistinct, but reaching towards them. Alara, confined mostly to the small upstairs room Caleb had cleared for her, found her initial wariness slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to erode. Caleb asked nothing of her. He brought her food, plain fare, but hot. He kept the stove going against the prairie chill. He spoke little, but his silences were not unkind. She saw the pain in his eyes when he thought no one was looking, the way his hand sometimes went to his bad leg, a gesture of unconscious, habitual agony. There was a shared woundedness between them, an unspoken understanding that transcended Prairie Creek's malice. Her own past was a constant, unwelcome companion. Silas Vance. Her father. The name alone was a brand. His rages, his heavy hands, the constant fear, and then the accident, the runaway wagon, his drunken fury at the reins, her own desperate, futile attempt to grab them, the splintering crash, the searing pain, then nothing, until she woke to a world seen from a chair, her legs useless, her spirit scarred almost as deeply as her body. She'd been running ever since, from his memory, from the pity and disgust of others. Prairie Creek was just the latest stop on a journey with no destination. How long before this fragile peace shatters, she'd find herself thinking, listening to the wind howl outside, a sound that echoed the desolation in her soul. Caleb, too, felt an unwelcome shift within himself. Ilara's presence was a disruption, a reminder of a world he'd tried to shut out. Her quiet courage, her refusal to be utterly broken by circumstance or by the town's cruelty, pricked at his carefully constructed defenses. He found himself listening for the soft creak of her chair wheels overhead, a sound that was slowly becoming less an intrusion and more a presence. His conscience, a long-dormant thing, was stirring. He'd seen too much of injustice, had inflicted too much pain in the name of causes long since turned to ash, to stand idly by while a cripple girl was tormented. But protecting her meant engagement, and engagement meant risk. The letter from Finn Rourke, still unopened, was a potent reminder of risks he'd sworn never to take again. The uneasy quiet was shattered late one night. A barrage of stones suddenly hammered against the workshop's boarded-up windows, followed by Jedediah Smith's jeering voice, amplified by drink and the darkness. "Hey, Stone, send out your little pet cripple. We got some presents for her." More laughter, uglier this time, punctuated by the thud of rocks against the door. Caleb was on his feet in an instant, his bad leg forgotten, the old soldier's instinct taking over. He grabbed the heavy iron bar he kept by the door. From the top of the stairs, Ilara's voice, tight but steady, called down, "Mr. Stone." "What is it?" "Just some trash blowing in the wind," Caleb growled. His eyes narrowed, staring at the rattling door. "Stay put. They won't stop," Ilara said, her voice closer now. He turned to see her at the head of the stairs, her face pale in the moonlight filtering through a grimy pane, but her eyes determined. In her lap, incongruously, lay one of his heavy wrenches. They never do, with people like Jedediah. Another volley of stones, one shattering the remaining glass in the window. "This is my workshop," Caleb said, his voice a low rumble. "My place. They ain't coming in." He didn't tell her to hide. He didn't need to. He saw in her eyes the same desperate, cornered resilience he felt in himself. They stood there together in the besieged dimness, two fractured souls, an unlikely, unspoken alliance formed against the howling malice outside. The town of Prairie Creek had shown its teeth, and the shadows from their pasts were drawing closer. The barrage of stones and Jedediah's drunken taunts eventually faded into the prairie wind, leaving behind a silence more unnerving than the assault. Inside Caleb's workshop, the air remained thick with unspoken words, with the ghost of violence that had brushed too close. The shattered window pane gaped like a fresh wound, a stark reminder of Prairie Creek's festering malice. Caleb, his face a granite mask, methodically boarded it up, the rhythmic thud of his hammer a grim counterpoint to the agitated beat of Ilara's heart. In the days that followed, a fragile, unspoken rhythm established itself within the workshop's cluttered confines. Ilara, from her chair, took to mending Caleb's threadbare shirts, her fingers, surprisingly nimble, coaxing neat stitches from worn fabric. She'd sort his collection of screws and bolts into meticulously labeled tins, a quiet order emerging from his habitual chaos. Caleb, in turn, would ensure the small stove in her alcove never went cold, would leave a tin plate of stew or beans on the stairs, his gruffness a thin veil over an almost paternal solicitude. They moved around each other with a careful deference, their silences more often companionable than strained. Two solitary ships finding temporary, wary anchorage in the same storm-tossed harbor. One evening, a particularly vicious nightmare, a maelstrom of splintering wood and her father's alcohol-fueled rage, ripped Ilara from sleep with a choked cry. Caleb, startled from his own fitful doze on a cot downstairs, found her trembling, her face slick with tears in the moonlight. He didn't speak, just poured her a cup of water, his presence a steady, undemanding bulwark against the terrors of the night. Later, as the first pale light of dawn seeped through the grimy windows, Elara, her voice low and raspy, began to speak, not of the accident, not yet, but of her mother, a gentlewoman with a laugh like wind chimes and hands that smelled of wildflowers. She spoke of a childhood that, for a time, had known sunshine and security, before sickness had stolen her mother away, leaving a void that Silas Vance, her father, had filled with bitterness and an ever-deepening cruelty. He wasn't always like he became, she whispered, staring at her hands. Ma's passing. It broke something in him. Or maybe it just let the badness out. Caleb listened, his silence an invitation, his own scarred heart recognizing the echoes of irreparable loss. The fragile peace was soon to be tested from new, more insidious quarters. One afternoon, while Caleb was out delivering a mended plowshare to a farm on the town's outskirts, a shadow fell across Elara's patch of sunlight. A man stood in the workshop doorway, impeccably dressed for Prairie Creek's rough standards. A faint, cloying scent of bay rum preceding him. He was of middling height, with a smooth, unreadable face and eyes that, despite their polite veneer, seemed to catalog everything, including her. Marcus Thorne. Miss Vance. I presume his voice was cultured, a stark contrast to the town's usual guttural tones. Forgive my intrusion. I was an old acquaintance of your father, Silas, passing through. Heard he might have settled hereabouts, or his family. Elara's spine stiffened. My father is not here. Thorne's smile was a brief, almost reptilian flicker. A pity. There was a small matter, an unsettled debt of sorts, I wished to discuss with him. His gaze drifted around the workshop, then settled back on her. Sharper now. He always had a fondness for keepsakes. Did he, by chance, leave anything with you? Something of your mother's. Perhaps a locket, a small journal. A cold dread trickled down Elara's spine. His words were smooth, but there was an undercurrent, a subtle pressure that set her teeth on edge. My father, she said, her voice carefully devoid of emotion, left me nothing but bad memories. Mr. Thorne, and I have nothing of his, nor of my mother's. That would interest you. Thorne's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer, a flicker of something, annoyance calculation, in their depths. A shame, he murmured. Well, perhaps our paths will cross again. He tipped his hat, a gesture of mock civility, and was gone, leaving Elara with a profound sense of unease. The scent of his bay rum an oily residue in the air. Caleb's past, too, chose that week to rear its ugly head. He was returning from the mercantile, a sack of beans over his shoulder, when a figure detached itself from the shadows of the alley beside the saloon. Finn Rourke, shorter than Caleb, but built like a bulldog, with a broken nose and eyes that held the flat, predatory gleam of a cornered wolf. The years had not been kind to Finn, but Caleb recognized him instantly, recognized the cold knot of dread that tightened in his own gut. Well, looky here, Finn rasped, his voice like sandpaper. Caleb Stone. Figured you'd crawled under a rock and died after everything. Caleb's hand instinctively went to the heavy wrench tucked in his belt. What do you want? Finn, what do I want? Finn gave a harsh laugh. Justice. Maybe, or just what's owed. You remember Quantrill's boys? Stone. Remember the burning. Remember who was left holding the bag while you played righteous deserter. His voice dripped venom. That little nest egg we acquired. You still got your share tucked away. Stone, 'cause I'm callin' in my marker. Caleb's face was grim. There was no nest egg. Finn. Just blood and ashes. I told you then. I wanted no part of it. But you took your cut. Didn't you? Finn sneered. Stepping closer. Don't lie to me. Stone. I need money. And you're gonna provide. Or maybe this town'd be interested in hearing about the war heroes' less heroic exploits. I've got nothing left to pay you with, Caleb said, his voice low. Dangerous. The war was a wound that had never truly healed. Its horrors a constant shadow. Finn Rourke was a living piece of that nightmare. Get out of Prairie Creek. Finn. And stay out. Finn held his gaze for a long moment, then spat on the ground. This ain't over. Stone. Not by a long shot. He melted back into the shadows, leaving Caleb shaken, the ghosts of his past clawing at him. He said nothing to Alara of the encounter, but his newfound tension, the way his eyes constantly scanned the street, did not go unnoticed by her. The external pressures mounted. Sheriff Brody, a man whose weariness seemed etched into the lines of his face, paid them a visit. He was polite enough, but his discomfort was palpable. Mr. Stone, Brody began, his gaze shifting uncomfortably between Caleb and Alara. Folks are concerned. Widow Higgins, some of the town council, about Miss Vance here. Rumors. You understand. Rumors are cheap currency in this town. Sheriff? Caleb said, his voice flat. Be that as it may. Brody sighed. There's talk of her father, Silas Vance. Ugly talk. And questions about, well, about her being here. With you, a young woman, alone. She needed shelter. Caleb stated. I offered it. That's the sum of it. Brody looked at Alara. Miss Vance, your father. There was some trouble back where you came from. Wasn't there? Something about an accident. Alara felt the familiar cold dread. The stares, the whispers, now the law itself, prodding at her wounds. The combined weight of Thorne's unsettling visit, Caleb's unspoken anxieties, and now Brody's probing questions, became too much. The dam of her carefully constructed composure finally broke. Her voice, when she began to speak, was barely a whisper, but it gained strength as the torrent of her story poured out. She told Caleb, and a stunned Sheriff Brody, everything. Of Silas Vance's descent into drunken brutality after her mother's death, of the beatings, the terror, the suffocating confinement, and then the accident. Not an accident. No, a deliberate act of malice. Silas, in a drunken rage, whipping the horses into a frenzy, her own desperate attempt to seize the reins, his brutal shove that sent her tumbling under the wheels of the careening wagon. She spoke of waking to a world of pain, her legs unresponsive, her life irrevocably altered. And then, Silas's ultimate betrayal, his flight. But not before he'd spread the vile, self-serving lie that she, his crippled daughter, had tried to seduce him, had caused the accident in a fit of jealous rage. The workshop was silent save for Alara's ragged breathing when she finished, tears streaming down her face. Caleb's hands were clenched into fists, his knuckles white, a murderous fury in his eyes. Sheriff Brody looked poleaxed. his face a mask of shock and dawning, horrified understanding. That monster. Caleb finally choked out, his voice thick with a rage that was almost terrifying in its intensity. He will pay for what he did. Elara, I swear to you, on whatever soul I have left, he will pay. As if the universe itself conspired to tighten the noose. It was at that precise moment, with Elara's raw confession still hanging heavy in the air, that Deputy Sykes, Brody's gangly, eager to please subordinate, burst into the workshop. Sheriff Brody, you gotta come quick. Sykes panted, his eyes wide. Old man Hemlock, he says he just remembered something. Something about that Vance girl and her pay. Brody, still reeling from Elara's story, frowned. Remembered what? Sykes says he saw Miss Vance here, just before that wagon, incident. Says she was arguing with her pay, real heated, and he thinks he saw her holding something shiny in her hand. Something kinda like a knife. Or maybe one of them sharpened tools. Sykes paused for dramatic effect. And Jebediah Smith and his boys, they just found something down by the old Vance cabin ruins, where the wagon went over. A piece of twisted metal. Sheriff? Looks like it might have come off a wheelchair. Elara stared, her blood running cold. A knife twisted metal lies. All lies. But she saw the flicker of doubt, of renewed suspicion, in Deputy Sykes's eyes, and even a troubled uncertainty in Sheriff Brody's. The trap, baited with her deepest pain, was being sprung. Caleb moved to stand beside her chair, his presence a solid, unyielding shield. More lies. Sheriff, he said, his voice a low growl, planted, no doubt, by those who want to see this girl silenced. Brody rubbed his face, the lines of conflict deepening. I have to investigate. Caleb, you know, I do. Elara looked at Caleb, despair warring with a desperate, burgeoning trust. They'll never believe me, she whispered, her voice raw with a grief that went beyond her own suffering. A grief for a world so quick to embrace the ugliest version of the truth. They always want to believe the worst. The painful truth of her past had been laid bare, only to be immediately ensnared in a fresh web of deceit. Prairie Creek, which had offered a fragile, fleeting illusion of sanctuary, was rapidly becoming a crucible, and the forces arrayed against them were gathering strength, their motives still murky, their menace undeniable. The acrid scent of Hemlock's lie and Deputy Sykes's wide-eyed pronouncements clung to Caleb's workshop long after Sheriff Brody had departed, his face a roadmap of unease. Prairie Creek, it seemed, had already tried and convicted Elara Vance in the kangaroo court of public opinion, eager to embrace any scrap of evidence that confirmed their darkest assumptions. A knife. Elara's voice was a hollow whisper, her face ashen. Twisted metal from my chair, suck Caleb. They're fabricating a monster out of me. Caleb slammed a fist onto his workbench, the tools rattling in protest. It's Thorn, he growled. The name a curse. Or that weasel, Jedediah, trying to stir the pot. Or both. They want you silenced. Or gone. His eyes, hard and flinty, met hers. We ain't gonna let that happen. Sheriff Brody, true to his reluctant word, returned the next morning. His questioning of Elara was less an interrogation and more a weary formality. He asked about the moments before the accident, about the shiny object Hemlock now conveniently recalled. Elara, though fear was a cold serpent coiling in her belly, answered with a clarity and intelligence that clearly impressed Brody, even if it didn't sway the tide of town sentiment. She recounted the argument with her father, his drunken rage, the struggle for the reins, but no knife, no weapon. The only weapon that day, Sheriff, she said, her voice trembling but firm, was my father's cruelty. Caleb stood by, a silent, unmovable presence, his gaze daring Brody to push too hard. The sheriff left with more questions than answers, his expression troubled, but the unspoken threat of official action hung heavy in the air. We can't trust Brody to find the truth in this town, Caleb said later, his voice flat. Not when everyone's already decided what they want the truth to be. So what do we do? Ilara asked, the fight in her eyes warring with a deep weariness. We find our own answers, Caleb declared, his limp more pronounced as he paced the cramped workshop. He began to lay out a plan. He'd revisit the old Vance cabin ruins himself, look for this twisted metal. He'd try to find out who had access, who might have planted it. Ilara, her mind sharp as any tool in his workshop, would help him piece together the inconsistencies, the timelines. From her chair, she became his strategist, her keen observations often uncovering details he, in his focused intensity, might have missed. Their clandestine investigation yielded little in the way of concrete proof, but much in the way of unsettling patterns. The discovery of the metal fragment coincided too neatly with Marcus Thorne's recent, quiet inquiries around town, and Hemlock's sudden, detailed memory of a shiny object felt rehearsed, prompted. Thorne wants something from you, Ilara, Caleb said, his brow furrowed. Something he thinks your father had. This evidence. It's a way to pressure you, to isolate you, maybe make you desperate enough to give him what he's looking for. Marcus Thorne, indeed, was not a patient man. Seeing the official investigation falter, and perhaps fearing Ilara might bolt or be incarcerated before he could achieve his objective, he decided on a more direct approach. Caleb had stepped out to the well, a brief errand. Thorne, moving with a predator's stealth, slipped into the workshop. Ilara heard the floorboards creak. Caleb, Thorne emerged from the shadows, his polite mask firmly in place, but his eyes holding a new, harder glint. Just me, Miss Vance. I find myself concerned for your welfare. This town, it's not kind to outsiders. He took a step closer. Perhaps if you were to confide in me. Your father, Silas. He often spoke of a small, leather-bound book, full of his thoughts, and certain valuable notations. You wouldn't happen to know of its whereabouts, would you? Its return would settle a great many old debts, and perhaps ease your current difficulties. I told you, Ilara said, her hand instinctively reaching for the heavy wrench Caleb always left within her reach. I have nothing of my father's. Thorne's smile thinned. A pity. Such a resilient spirit. It would be a shame to see it unnecessarily burdened. The implied threat was unmistakable. He took another step, his gaze flicking around the room, as if mentally inventorying its contents, as if the heavens themselves conspired to pile on the pressure. Finn Rourke chose that afternoon to make his next move. He cornered Caleb in the narrow alley behind the blacksmith's, as Caleb returned from a fruitless attempt to question Hemlock. Getting yourself in a whole heap of trouble, ain't ya? Stone Finn sneered, blocking Caleb's path. Playin' hero to a little cripple girl. Real noble. He jabbed a thick finger into Caleb's chest. But nobility don't pay old debts. I need that money. Stone. Now, or those less heroic exploits of yours. They're gonna become Prairie Creek's favorite bedtime story. I told you. Finn, I don't have it, Caleb growled, his patience worn thin. The war. Finn. Thorn. The town's venom. It was a tightening vice. Then find it. Finn's voice rose. Or maybe I pay a visit to your little workshop. See if there's anything worth taking there. A man gets desperate. Stone. And I'm real desperate. He shoved Caleb hard against the wall, the impact jarring his bad leg. You got till nightfall. Then all bets are off. Finn melted away, leaving Caleb with a throbbing leg and a cold fury in his heart. He was being squeezed, trapped between his loyalty to Elara and the festering boil of his own past. Jedediah Smith, meanwhile, needed little prompting. The town was a tinderbox of rumor and resentment, and Elara's crime, amplified by Hemlock's dubious recollections and the evidence from the cabin, was the spark. Jed, emboldened by the official scrutiny on Caleb and Elara, and perhaps given a sly nudge and a few silver dollars from someone like Thorn who benefited from chaos, gathered his cronies. Tonight, they would deliver Prairie Creek's justice. Tonight, they would run the cripple and her protector out of town. Or worse, night descended on Prairie Creek like a shroud. The wind, which had been a mournful whisper, now rose to a frantic howl, mirroring the storm brewing within the town's dark heart. Inside the workshop, Caleb and Elara waited, the air thick with an almost unbearable tension. Caleb had barricaded the door as best he could, his rifle loaded, his face a grim, determined mask. Elara, her wrench clutched in her lap, her eyes wide but resolute, sat near the workbench, a small arsenal of heavy tools within her reach. The first stone crashed against the boarded window with the force of a cannonball. Then another, and another. Jedediah's voice, raw and filled with a mob's ugly courage, echoed from the street. Stone. Vance, come on out and face your medicine. Prairie Creek don't want your kind here. The workshop door shuddered under a heavy blow. Caleb raised his rifle. Stay back from the windows. Elara. He fired a shot into the air through the shattered pane, the roar of the rifle momentarily silencing the mob. But only momentarily. They surged forward again, a dark, faceless mass, their rage fueled by ignorance and a thirst for cruel entertainment. Elara, her heart hammering, saw a shadow flicker at the back alley window, smaller, stealthier than the brutes at the door. Marcus Thorn, using the mob as his distraction. He was prying at the latch. Caleb, the back, she screamed, wheeling her chair with surprising speed, grabbing a heavy metal file. As Caleb turned to confront Thorn, who had just managed to slip the latch and was easing the window open, the workshop's main door finally splintered, giving way with a sickening crack. Jedediah and his foremost thugs spilled in, brandishing clubs and rocks. Caleb was caught between two fires. He spun, his rifle spitting, driving Jed's men back a step, then whirled again as Thorn lunged for a small, locked strongbox on Caleb's workbench, the very box where Caleb kept his meager savings, and Elara now realized with a sickening lurch the few remaining trinkets that had belonged to her mother, things she'd managed to keep hidden from Silas. That girl has something I need, Thorn snarled, his polite facade gone, revealing the avaricious core beneath. As he wrestled with Caleb for the box, Elara didn't hesitate. With a cry of fury, she hurled the heavy file. It struck Thorn's arm, forcing him to release his grip on the box with a yelp of pain. The fight was a desperate, chaotic melee. Caleb, His bad leg a hindrance, but his old soldier's instincts sharp. Fought with a cold, brutal efficiency, using his rifle as a club, his fists like iron. Ilara, from her chair, became a whirlwind of desperate invention, flinging tools, using a long metal rod to trip one of Jed's men. Her voice, surprisingly strong, shouting warnings and encouragement to Caleb. "I may be in a chair," she yelled, as a lout grabbed for her, "but I am not helpless." She brought the wrench down hard on his outstretched hand. Suddenly, another figure burst through the now open back window. Finn Rourke, his face a mask of savage intent. But he wasn't looking at Thorn or the mob. His eyes were locked on Caleb. "You owe me a life. Stone," he roared, launching himself at Caleb from behind. Just as Caleb was about to land a decisive blow on Jed, the attack threw Caleb off balance, Finn's weight sending them both crashing to the floor. It was then that Sheriff Brody, his face grim, flanked by two nervous-looking but determined townsmen, Mr. Ainsworth from the feed store and the young blacksmith, Tom Backman, both armed with shotguns, finally burst through the ruined front door. "Enough," Brody roared, his own shotgun leveled. "This madness ends now." The sudden appearance of the sheriff and armed citizens gave the mob pause. Jedediah, seeing the tide turn, began to back away. Thorn, clutching his injured arm, his eyes darting towards the strongbox, then towards the armed newcomers, seemed to be weighing his options. Finn, however, was oblivious, his entire being focused on Caleb. They grappled on the floor, a desperate, brutal struggle. "You left me for dead, Stone," Finn snarled, his fingers clawing for Caleb's throat. In the midst of the chaos, as Brody's men began to subdue Jed's thugs, Ilara saw her chance. The strongbox had slid near her chair. With a surge of adrenaline, she grabbed it. Thorn saw her, his eyes blazing. He lunged, but Caleb, with a desperate heave, threw Finn off him. He saw Thorn bearing down on Ilara. With a roar of pure, protective fury, he launched himself at Thorn, tackling him hard, sending them both sprawling away from Ilara and the box. During their fall, something spilled from Thorn's coat pocket, a small, folded piece of oilskin. Caleb, in the ensuing scuffle, his hand scrabbling for purchase, inadvertently grabbed it. Brody's voice cut through the din again. "Thorn, Rourke, it's over. You're under arrest." The fight bled out of Thorn. Finn, seeing Caleb momentarily distracted by the object in his hand, tried to bolt, but Ainsworth's shotgun persuaded him otherwise. After the last of Jed's gang had been rounded up or had fled into the night, after Thorn and a sullen Finn Rourke were in manacles, Brody turned to Caleb and Ilara, his face etched with a new understanding and a profound weariness. Caleb uncurled his fingers. In his palm lay the oilskin packet. Inside was a crudely drawn map and a small, tarnished silver locket, identical to one Ilara had described as her mother's, one Silas had always coveted. And pinned to the map was a receipt for a significant sum of money, paid to one Jebediah Smith, signed with an elegant, spidery flourish M. Thorn, for services rendered in discrediting E. Vance. The misleading evidence suddenly had a source, a very clear source. Brody looked at the items, then at Thorn's murderous glare. "Looks like your old acquaintance with Silas Vance involved more than just unsettled debts." Thorn. He turned to Caleb and Ilara. "This town, it owes you an apology, Miss Vance, though I doubt you'll get one from most of 'em." Caleb looked at Ilara. her face bruised, her clothes torn, but her eyes shining with a fierce, unbreakable spirit. He knew Brody was right. Prairie Creek was a viper's nest. Even with Thorn and Finn temporarily neutralized, the poison of suspicion and hatred would linger. They couldn't stay. "Sheriff," Caleb said, his voice rough with exhaustion and a dawning resolve. "This place, it ain't safe for her. For us." Brody nodded slowly, a flicker of something akin to regret in his eyes. "No," he admitted. "No, it ain't. Thorn's got money. He'll have lawyers. Finn, men like him always have friends." He hesitated. The eastbound stage leaves at dawn. It's usually lightly guarded this time of year, till it hits the railhead. I might find myself occupied with paperwork until well after sunup. It was as close to help as a conflicted lawman in a rotten town could offer. The storm over Prairie Creek had broken, but the wreckage it left behind was immense. Caleb and Alara had survived, their fragile alliance forged into something stronger in the crucible of that terrible night. But the fight was far from over. They had a locket, a map, and the name of a monster still at large, Silas Vance. And as the first gray light of dawn touched the ravaged workshop, they knew their journey had just taken another desperate, uncertain turn. Escape was their only option, but the road ahead was shrouded in shadows, and the echoes from their pasts were still baying for their blood. The eastbound stage, a rattling, dust-choked purgatory, was their only passage from the hell that Prairie Creek had become. Sheriff Brody's taciturn promise of paperwork had bought them precious hours. They'd slipped away from Caleb's ravaged workshop as the first gray light bled into the sky, carrying little more than the clothes on their backs. Ilara's salvaged strongbox clutched tightly in her lap, and the damning evidence against Marcus Thorne. Caleb's few tools and Ilara's mended wheelchair were hastily loaded, their meager possessions a testament to lives stripped bare. The journey was a brutal tapestry of jolting discomfort, scarce water, and the ever-present thrum of fear. Every distant rider, every unexplained halt, sent a jolt of adrenaline through Caleb. Ilara, though her body ached from the constant jarring, kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, her resilience a quiet rebuke to their pursuers. Real or imagined, Caleb, his bad leg a torment, found his old soldier's instincts sharpening, his senses attuned to the slightest hint of danger. They changed conveyances twice, trading the stage for a farmer's rickety wagon, then for passage on a slow-moving keelboat, each transition a desperate attempt to blur their trail, to shed the clinging scent of Prairie Creek's malice. The oilskin packet with Thorne's map, the locket, and the incriminating receipt was tucked deep within Caleb's saddlebag, a dangerous secret that bound them together. Riverbend, when they finally reached it weeks later, was a shock to the system, a sprawling, brawling city clinging to the banks of a wide, muddy river. It was a cacophony of steam whistles, rumbling drays, and 1,000 competing voices. Larger, more impersonal than Prairie Creek. It offered the anonymity they craved, but also a daunting new set of challenges. With the last of their meager funds, Caleb secured a cramped, 2-room apartment above a noisy cooperage in a teeming, polyglot district near the docks, the air thick with the smells of tar, fish, and unwashed humanity. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a fragile foothold in a world that felt alien and indifferent. Caleb, his skills with tools, his only currency, managed to rent a tiny, stall-like space in a crowded alleyway, hanging out a crudely painted sign, "C. Stone, repairs and general tinkering." Business was slow, The competition fierce. Elara, her hands never idle, began to transform scraps of wood, wire, and discarded fabric into small, intricate trinkets, carved animals, delicate wire flowers, cleverly jointed dolls. She'd send Caleb out to try and sell them at the city market, her pride warring with their desperate need for every penny. Initial failures were many. The city folk were harried, their eyes harder to catch than Prairie Creek's, their purses tighter. The ghosts of their past were not easily outrun. Marcus Thorne, Caleb knew, was not a man to accept defeat. He imagined Thorne's agents, unseen, sifting through the city's underbelly, listening for whispers of a limping handyman and a girl in a wheeled chair. He'd catch Elara staring at shadows, her face drawn. The locket, her mother's locket, now reclaimed, clutched in her hand like a talisman. The thought of Finn Rourke, too, still gnawed at Caleb, a cold stone in his gut. Finn was a bloodhound. If he was desperate enough, he'd track Caleb to the ends of the earth. The warrant from Prairie Creek, based on Hemlock's lies and Thorne's planted evidence, was another specter, a legal noose that could tighten at any moment if their whereabouts became known. Sleep offered little respite, often bringing nightmares of Prairie Creek's mob, of Thorne's cold eyes, of Silas Vance's brutal face. Then, a sliver of light pierced their gloom. Lin Yao, a young Chinese immigrant with intelligent eyes and a quiet, dignified demeanor, ran a small laundry stall near Caleb's makeshift workshop. He'd often see Elara, her chair positioned just inside Caleb's stall for a sliver of sun, her fingers flying as she worked. One sweltering afternoon, seeing her struggle to reach a dropped tool, Lin Yao had stepped over, retrieved it with a shy smile, and offered her a cup of cool tea. An unlikely friendship blossomed, built on shared outsider status and mutual respect. Lin Yao, with his network of contacts within the city's immigrant community, began to steer small repair jobs Caleb's way, and found a few sympathetic vendors willing to display Elara's crafts. Slowly, painstakingly, their fortunes began to turn. Caleb's meticulous work gained a reputation for reliability. Elara's unique, beautifully crafted items began to attract discerning buyers. One such buyer was Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, a wealthy, somewhat eccentric widow known for her collection of antique music boxes. She was captivated by a small, intricately carved bird Elara had made, its tiny gears allowing its wings to flutter. Impressed, she entrusted Elara with a far more challenging task: the repair of a prized, but damaged, 18th century Swiss music box. Elara worked on the delicate mechanism for days, her concentration absolute, Caleb often watching her, a quiet admiration in his eyes. The pressure was immense. Then, disaster, a moment of distraction, a sudden, sharp pain in her own damaged spine, a lingering tremor from the stress of their flight, and a crucial, irreplaceable gear slipped from her grasp, shattering on the stone floor. Despair washed over Elara. This was more than just a broken music box. It felt like a judgment, a confirmation of her own fractured existence. Caleb found her in tears, the shattered pieces on her workbench. I have to tell her," Elara whispered. Her voice choked. I can't lie." Caleb merely nodded, his hand resting briefly, awkwardly, on her shoulder. When Mrs. Patterson arrived, Elara, her face pale but her gaze steady, confessed everything, offering what little money they had as recompense. The wealthy widow listened, her expression unreadable. Then, to Elara's astonishment, Mrs. Patterson smiled. "My dear child," she said, her voice surprisingly kind, "that music box was old, and perhaps a little tired. Your honesty, however, is a rare and precious thing indeed, worth far more than any antique." She then looked at the sketches Ilara had made for her own. "Original designs. You offered to make me a new one. From your own imagination. Should this one prove beyond repair, I believe I would like that very much. Something unique. Something with your spirit in it." This unexpected act of grace, of trust, was a profound turning point for Ilara. It was a validation of her skill, her integrity, a stark contrast to the suspicion and contempt she had so often faced. Through Mrs. Patterson, they were introduced to Mr. Alistair Ainsworth, a dapper, discerning gentleman who represented the interests of several wealthy East Coast families seeking unique artisanal goods. He visited Caleb's humble workshop, his keen eyes taking in not just Ilara's exquisite craftsmanship with her small mechanical wonders, but also Caleb's ingenuity in repairing complex machinery with limited tools. He was particularly fascinated by a miniature, working model of a water wheel Caleb had built from scraps, a project born of idle hours and a restless mind. Mr. Ainsworth, after several visits and much thoughtful observation, made them an astonishing offer, a substantial contract to design and produce a series of intricate mechanical novelties and decorative automata for his clients in New York City. It meant a workshop, proper tools, a chance to leave their hand-to-mouth existence behind. It meant, potentially, a future. The offer hung in the air between Caleb and Ilara, heavy with possibility and fraught with unspoken anxieties. New York. It was another world, unimaginably distant. It's your talent they want, Ilara," Caleb said gruffly one evening, staring out at the gas-lit squalor of Riverbend. "The automatons, the delicate work. I'm just a tinkerer." Ilara wheeled her chair to face him, her gaze unwavering. "No, Caleb," she said, her voice firm. "They saw your water wheel. They saw the way you make broken things whole again. They saw us both." She reached out, her hand briefly touching his scarred one. "We started this, whatever this is, together, in that dusty workshop in Prairie Creek, with a mob at the door. If we go further, if we take this chance, it has to be together, as a team, or not at all." Caleb looked at her, at the fierce loyalty in her eyes, and felt something shift within him, a thawing of old ice. He wasn't just her protector anymore. They were partners. But before any decisions about New York could be made, the ghosts of their past made one final, desperate bid for their present. Marcus Thorne, his patience clearly exhausted, had not given up his pursuit of whatever he believed Silas Vance had left behind, likely the locket and the map to whatever it represented. He'd been subtle in Riverbend, spreading whispers, trying to discredit them, perhaps hoping to drive Ilara into a desperate bargain. Now, he escalated. One evening, as Caleb and Ilara discussed Ainsworth's offer, Lin Yao burst in, his usual composure shattered. "Mr. Caleb, Miss Ilara, bad men. They ransacked your stall, Mr. Caleb, and they asked for you, by name. Said Mr. Thorne sends his displeasure." Caleb's blood ran cold. Thorne was done playing games. At the same moment, a familiar, unwelcome shadow fell across their doorway. Finn Rourke, his face uglier and more desperate than Caleb remembered. "Figured I'd find you here." "Stone," Finn rasped, his eyes darting around the small apartment. Heard you were comin' into some money. New York, they say." He grinned, a feral, humorless expression. "That debt. Stone, it's time to pay up. With interest. Or maybe your new lady friend here can help persuade you." Caleb stepped in front of Alara, his body a shield. "You've taken enough from me. Finn," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "My past. My peace. You're not touching her. And you're not getting another damn cent. Not this time." The confrontation was brutal, swift, and confined to the cramped alleyway outside. Finn, fueled by desperation and cheap whiskey, was a wild animal. But Caleb, fueled by a cold rage and the fierce, protective instinct that Alara had awakened in him, was something more. He fought not just for himself, but for her, for the fragile future that had just been offered them. When it was over, Finn Rourke lay groaning in the dirt, his threats silenced, his hold on Caleb finally, irrevocably broken. Caleb, bruised and bleeding, sat standing tall, had faced down one demon. Marcus Thorne proved more elusive. He didn't confront them directly again after Lin Yao's warning. Instead, a message arrived via a terrified street urchin. "The locket and the map. My patience is at an end. Leave them at the abandoned pier by midnight, or Riverbend will become far more inhospitable than Prairie Creek ever was." Caleb and Alara looked at each other. The locket was Alara's last tangible link to her mother. The map, it was a mystery, a potential danger, but also perhaps a clue to the full extent of Silas Vance's treachery. The reason for Thorne's relentless pursuit. "We can't give it to him," Alara said, her voice firm. It's all I have left of her. And whatever he wants it for, it can't be good." With Lin Yao's hesitant but loyal help, they laid a trap. Not with the real locket and map, but with decoys. When Thorne's hired thugs crept onto the pier at midnight, they found not their prize, but Caleb Stone, a length of iron pipe in his hand, and the unexpected, swift arrival of the Riverbend Night Watch, alerted by an anonymous tip from Lin Yao. Thorne himself was not present, but his power in Riverbend was dealt a significant, if not fatal, blow. His network was disrupted, his immediate threat neutralized. Though Caleb knew men like Thorne didn't simply disappear, a week later, battered but unbowed, Caleb and Alara stood on the deck of an eastbound paddle steamer, the roar of Riverbend receding behind them. Mr. Ainsworth's contract, signed and sealed, was in Caleb's pocket. New York awaited. It was a leap into the unknown, a gamble on a future they could barely imagine. As they watched the city lights fade, Alara shivered, though the night was warm. "Do you think, are we finally free of them?" "Thorne, my father." Caleb put a calloused hand over hers where it rested on the arm of her chair. "We're free of Prairie Creek. We're free of Riverbend. As for the rest," he looked out at the dark, churning water. "We'll face that when it comes. Together." The offer from Mr. Ainsworth was a lifeline, a chance. But just as the steamer cleared the last of Riverbend's sprawling docks, a dockhand handed Caleb a telegram, forwarded with Ainsworth's assistance. It was from Sheriff Brody. Short, stark, and chilling. Silas Vance spotted San Francisco, asking about a locket. And a daughter. Be careful. The fragile sanctuary had shattered. The past was not only unburied, it was on their trail. New York, and the hope it represented, suddenly felt a million miles away, obscured by the long, dark shadow of Silas Vance. The telegram from Sheriff Brody lay on the small table in their Riverbend apartment like a coiled rattlesnake. Its venomous message: Silas Vance spotted, San Francisco, asking about a locket. And a daughter. Be careful. Poisoning the fragile hope that Mr. Ainsworth's New York offer had briefly kindled. The paddle steamer, once a symbol of escape and new beginnings, now felt like a gilded cage, hurtling them towards an uncertain future, while the long, dark shadow of Alara's father stretched across the continent, threatening to engulf them once more. For days, a heavy silence hung between Caleb and Alara. New York, with its promise of a proper workshop and societal respect, seemed an impossible dream, a cruel mirage. How could they build a future when the past, embodied by Silas Vance, was actively hunting them? Caleb saw the old, haunted look return to Alara's eyes. The way her hand would unconsciously seek the locket she now wore hidden beneath her dress. His own ghosts, temporarily subdued, stirred restlessly. Finn Rourke might be dealt with. Marcus Thorne's immediate threat in Riverbend blunted. But Silas Vance. Silas was the architect of Alara's deepest pain, a monster whose cruelty knew no bounds. It was Lin Yao, their steadfast friend, who brought the news, his usual quiet composure fractured by a mixture of shock and something akin to awe. He carried a week-old edition of the Riverbend Chronicle, its pages already yellowing, folded open to a small, tucked-away column reprinting a dispatch from the San Francisco Call. Mr. Caleb, Miss Alara, Lin Yao said, his voice hushed. You must see this. Caleb took the paper, his eyes scanning the headline. Notorious abuser Silas Vance found dead. Suicide note confesses all. A cold dread, quickly followed by a surge of disbelief, washed over Caleb. He read aloud, his voice flat, devoid of inflection, the words falling like hammer blows in the quiet room. Silas Vance, cornered by gambling debts and perhaps the dawning realization that his past was catching up to him, had taken his own life in a dingy San Francisco boarding house. But it was what he'd left behind that stole their breath a rambling. 12-page letter. A final, desperate act of self-immolation. Or perhaps, in some twisted way, a bid for a perverse kind of redemption. In it, Silas, with a stark, brutal clarity that had been absent in his life, confessed everything. His descent into alcoholism and violence after his wife's death, the systematic, cruel abuse of his daughter, Alara, the accident, no accident at all, but a deliberate, drunken act of rage, his pushing Alara from the speeding wagon, and then, his most cowardly act, the vicious lies he'd spread to cover his crime, painting Alara as a seductress, a pariah, to destroy her credibility should she ever dare to speak the truth. Alara listened, her face as pale as alabaster, her hands gripping the arms of her wheelchair so tightly her knuckles were white. When Caleb finished reading, a long, shuddering sigh escaped her, a sound that seemed to carry years of unshed tears, of unspoken pain. Finally, she whispered, her voice hoarse. Finally, the truth is spoken, not in my words, which no one would believe, but by his own cowardice, his own hand. It was not triumph in her voice, nor even hatred, only a profound, bone-deep weariness, and the first, fragile stirring of a terrible weight being lifted. The confession had further repercussions. Silas, in his rambling screed, had mentioned hiring a certain smooth-talking gentleman named Thorne to locate his daughter and retrieve certain sentimental items he believed she possessed, the locket, and a small, coded journal his wife had kept, which Silas, in his paranoia, believed contained secrets that could ruin him further. This, then, was Marcus Thorne's motive, not some grand, shadowy conspiracy, but the grubby errand of a desperate, abusive man. With Silas dead, Thorne's leverage, his purpose in pursuing Elara, had largely evaporated. The false evidence in Prairie Creek, bought and paid for by Thorne on Silas's coin, was now exposed for the vicious fabrication it was. The news, when it broke fully in Riverbend via fresh telegraph reports and more prominent newspaper articles, sent a ripple through the city. Initially, some of Mr. Ainsworth's wealthier, more conservative clients, who had been intrigued by Elara's talent but wary of the scandal the Prairie Creek rumors had hinted at, pulled back. Whispers of damaged goods and unfortunate associations circulated in polite drawing rooms. But then, the tide turned. Mrs. Patterson, her formidable social standing a weapon she wielded with precision, penned a scathing letter to the editor of the Chronicle, lauding Elara's courage, her integrity in the face of unimaginable suffering, and denouncing the vile slanders that had pursued her. Mr. Ainsworth, his own respect for Caleb and Elara deepened by these revelations, publicly reaffirmed his faith in their talent and character. Ligno, with quiet dignity, shared their story with the tight-knit immigrant community, who, understanding persecution, offered their silent, steadfast support. Slowly, the narrative in Riverbend shifted from one of scandal to one of profound admiration for Elara's resilience and Caleb's unwavering loyalty. The legal loose ends began to tie themselves up. Marcus Thorne, implicated by Silas's confession and the evidence Caleb had wrested from him in Prairie Creek, forwarded by a now much more proactive Sheriff Brody, found himself the subject of a federal warrant for conspiracy and extortion. He vanished from Riverbend, likely seeking obscurity in some new territory. His schemes in ruins, his power, built on deceit, crumbled when exposed to the light of truth. Finn Rourke's chapter in Caleb's life also found its grim conclusion. Word reached Caleb, through the frontier grapevine that connected even disparate souls, that Finn, in a desperate attempt to fund his escape from his own mounting debts and enemies, had been killed during a bungled stagecoach robbery far to the south. Caleb felt a complex mixture of emotions, a grim relief that the direct threat was gone, but also a profound sadness for the waste of a life, for a man who, like himself, had been scarred by war but had chosen a darker path. The hold Finn had over him, built on shared trauma and past sins, was finally broken, not by violence, but by the inexorable turning of fate's cruel wheel. Caleb made a silent vow to whatever gods might be listening. He would not let his own past consume him as Finn's had. Mr. Ainsworth, his dapper suit a symbol of a world far removed from their recent struggles, visited them in their small apartment. His earlier offer from New York now reiterated with even greater conviction. "My dear Miss Vance, Mr. Stone," he said, his voice sincere, "what you have endured, it is a testament to your character. New York still awaits. The contract stands. In fact, your story, it has a power, a resonance. There are those who would be honored to support artists of such fortitude." That evening, Caleb and Elara sat in the quiet of their rooms. The roar of Riverbend a distant murmur. The path to New York, once shrouded in fear, was now clear, an open road to a future of potential fame and fortune. Caleb looked at Elara. Well, he asked, his voice gruff. Ainsworth's waiting for an answer. New York. It's a long way from Prairie Creek. Elara was silent for a long moment, her gaze distant. She touched the locket at her throat. Her mother's face, her father's rages, the jeering mob in Prairie Creek, Thorne's cold eyes, Finn's desperate snarl, Mrs. Patterson's unexpected kindness, Lin Yao's quiet friendship, Caleb's unwavering presence. It all swirled within her. Prairie Creek taught me about cruelty. Caleb, she said softly. Riverbend taught me about kindness, about second chances. She looked around their cramped, humble lodgings, at the tools of her craft, at the sturdy workbench Caleb had built. Mr. Ainsworth offers us success. But what is success if it means leaving behind the place where we finally began to heal? Her eyes met his, clear and strong. Fame and fortune in New York might be fine. Caleb, she said, a small, determined smile playing on her lips. But what we're starting to build here, the way Mrs. Patterson believed in me, the way Lin Yao helped us when no one else would, it feels like more than just a workshop. It feels like roots. She paused. I think our work is here. Caleb listened, a slow understanding dawning in his own weary soul. He thought of the quiet satisfaction of mending something broken, of the flicker of hope in Elara's eyes when one of her creations came to life. He thought of Lin Yao's quiet determination, of the other struggling souls he saw every day in Riverbend's teeming streets. New York was a grand stage, but perhaps, just perhaps, the most important work was done in smaller, quieter places. Roots, he echoed, the word feeling strange but not unwelcome on his tongue. Yeah, maybe you're right, Elora. Maybe this is where we make our stand. They did not go to New York. Instead, with a loan from a deeply impressed Mr. Ainsworth, and with Mrs. Patterson as their first official patron, Caleb and Elara expanded their small workshop. It became more than just a place of business. They began to take on apprentices. Lin Yao was their first, eager to learn Caleb's skills with metal and wood. Then came others, a young man who had lost an arm in a mill accident, a widow struggling to feed her children, a boy who had run away from an abusive apprenticeship. People like themselves, drifting souls, whom society had discarded or overlooked. Caleb taught them tinkering, repair, the satisfaction of shaping raw materials into something useful, something whole. Elara, her own artistry blossoming, taught them intricate craftwork, the delicate mechanics of her automata, the patience and precision required to create beauty from scraps. She became their inspiration, her quiet strength, her resilience in the face of her own profound disabilities, a testament to the indomitable human spirit. One young woman, her face scarred from a fire, once whispered to Elara, her eyes shining with unshed tears, "Because of you, Miss Vance, because of this place, I know I'm not useless. I know I can still make something beautiful." Elara, in teaching others, in sharing her skills and her story, found a deeper healing. The nightmares of Silas Vance still came, sometimes, but they no longer held the same power. Her past was a part of her, an undeniable scar, but it no longer defined her. She was defined now by her courage, her compassion, her creations. Caleb, too, found a measure of peace he had never thought possible. The ghosts of war, the shadow of Finn Rourke, began to recede. Watching Elara, seeing the hope she ignited in others, he found a purpose that transcended mere survival. that went beyond simply protecting. He was building, creating not just objects, but a community, a sanctuary. The final scene of their story is not one of grand triumph, not a fairy tale ending. It is a quiet afternoon in the bustling workshop, now known throughout Riverbend as the Phoenix Works, rebuilt and repaired. The air is filled with the scent of sawdust, hot metal, and bubbling glue, with the rhythmic sounds of hammers, saws, and files, with the murmur of voices, sometimes frustrated, often hopeful, occasionally punctuated by laughter. Caleb, his limp still pronounced, but his shoulders straighter, moves among the apprentices, offering a gruff word of advice here, a nod of approval there. Elara, from her specially constructed workbench, her hands a blur of motion as she assembles a delicate clockwork birds, looks up, her gaze meeting Caleb's across the crowded room. No words are needed. In that shared glance is a universe of understanding of battles fought and won, of pain endured and transformed, of two broken souls who, together, had not only mended themselves, but were now mending a small corner of a fractured world. The light at the end of their long, dark tunnel was not the dazzling glare of fame or fortune, but the warm, steady glow of shared purpose, of lives rebuilt, of hope rekindled, one painstaking repair, one intricate creation, one mended spirit at a time. And that, they both knew, was a light bright enough to illuminate any darkness. If this story stirred something in you, made you feel, think, or simply pause, I'd love to hear it. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Was there a moment that hit hardest A-line that stayed with you? This channel isn't just about storytelling, it's about connection, healing, and truth. So don't be shy. Speak up. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. It's completely free, and every subscriber helps us keep sharing stories that matter, stories that often go unheard. Thanks for spending your time here. We don't take it for granted.